It's a pleasure to see you all and to be here. This is actually a familiar room to me. I came to Yale, in 1963 to 5, I had a room on the quadrangle here. It was before the Vietnam draft, and so divinity students were not that plentiful, and they had extra rooms for graduate students. So I lived right here and took many meals in this room. And remember, for instance, one person you could have a meal with was Kenneth Scott Latourette, Uncle Ken, as we called him. So there's continuity with the 19th century here in this place. What I'm going to say today is probably not new to many of you, though it's my take on what is familiar, and if you're not so familiar with the North American scene, it may be valuable to see my insights over more than half a century, my experience with Edwards. I first encountered the brilliance of Edwards very near to here, about 100 yards, in the Divinity School library reading room. Was a very nice place to go to read. I was taking a course from Sidney Alstrom on religion in America, or theology in America, which is pretty much the same thing for him. And I remember I was reading Douglas Elwood's book, The Philosophical Theology of Jonathan Edwards, sitting in that room. And I remember him quoting at length. In fact, I have the book, and I can see where I marked the underlinings and the X's and so forth. And he was commenting on the divine and supernatural light. And Elwood said, the spiritual sense is without any long chain of arguments. The argument is but one, and the evidence direct. It is overpowering and all-conquering. Then he quotes from Edwards' sermons, God is God and distinguished chiefly by his divine beauty, which is infinitely diverse from other beauty. And Edwards, the new sense enables the mind to rise above the sensuous to appreciate the spiritual beauty. I remember vividly that it was a sunny day and the light was pouring in the windows, this kind of windows, and having those words just had an impact on me, seeing the beauty of the sunlight and that lesser beauty pointing toward the higher beauty. And it was not exactly a mystical experience. It was something like an awakening or not a conversion experience, but in the sense of something that I was already committed to taking on a new kind of life in a way it never had quite before. Perhaps it was something like what holiness people refer to as a second blessing, or it was a of course experience where you've known something and then you all of a sudden you see it with a greater clarity. Everything comes together, and this, of course, is what it's all about. And it's seeing the role of beauty in religion, an experience of gaining a new sense that God is constantly communicating the triune love through Jesus Christ, and that there's a beauty in that perfect love, and that if we have the eyes to see it, is an irresistible beauty. So my first question as a historian is, why hadn't I heard about this before? In my first 24 years, I was 24 at the time, I had grown up in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which was a sufficiently reformed background. My father was a very well-educated clergyman. Our house had books everywhere. There was no Jonathan Edwards book there. And perhaps more tellingly, I had just graduated from Westminster Theological Seminary, and Edwards was given due respect in the church history course, in the colonial history course. There was some attention to Edwards' work, but in the systematic theology courses, Edwards was hardly mentioned. The systematic theologian was John Murray, who came from the Wee Free Church in Scotland, who was thoroughly reformed and almost Edwardsian in the intensity. He was a wonderful lecturer in the intensity of his combining a sense of spirituality with Reformed doctrine. But the problem at Westminster was that all the original faculty had studied at Princeton Theological Seminary, and they were very self-consciously in the tradition of Hodge and not in the tradition of New England. So, though Murray seldom referred to Hodge, it was still a requirement for the systematic theology courses that we had to read the 3 volumes of the systematic theology and take a preliminary test on those 3 volumes, which Sidney Alston thought was just bizarre, that people were still reading Hodge. So Edwards was neglected there, and I had the opportunity. I went back to visit some friends at Westminster after I had discovered him here. This was in the fall of 1963. And I asked Murray about Edwards, and he said, "Oh, yes, Edwards is superb, in his Scottish brogue." But Edwards didn't really show up on as someone that was an exemplar for the Reformed aspiring Reformed theologians at that time. And to show that was not, that was a sort of accidental neglect of Edwards and not a principial neglect, really, 40-some years later, just after I published the Jonathan Edwards of Life in 2003, Westminster Theological Seminary invited me, gave me an honorary degree, which is not something I ordinarily get. And so I said at the time, I think the reason why they wanted to give me an honorary degree was that Sam Logan, the president, at that time was a great Edwards fan, and I think he wanted to really would like to have given the degree to Edwards, but I was the next best thing. Well, by that time, by 2003, I had sort of caught a wave when that biography came out. Edwards was becoming the hottest thing in Reformed theology. At Westminster, the best-known person who had studied there, Tim Keller, was a great Edwards fan, and within a few years, there was the Time magazine article on the new Calvinism as one of the 10 things, new things changing the world right now, and of course there was Colin Hansen's book, Young, Restless, and Reformed, featuring the famous Jonathan Edwards is my homeboy on the cover. So my question is, what happened? Really within just one generation, to move Edwards from being mostly neglected, even in the most reformed circles, very strictly reformed circles, to becoming not only a prominent reformed figure, but an international figure, and a figure who is revered both in theological scholarship and in scholarship more generally. Well, to answer that question, what happened, I think we have to look at two primary stories that overlap with each other. One story is that of the Reformed community's embrace of Edwards, and the other story is mainline academic and mainline Protestant prior appreciation of Edwards and promotion of Edwards scholarship, a story that centers overwhelmingly in what has been going on here and is what is now the Jonathan Edwards Center. But let me first start with the question of why Edwards was neglected in the Reformed theological, much of the Reformed theological community. I'm pretty sure my experience at Westminster wasn't so unusual, that Edwards was just not on the Reformed radar very much. The one big exception was John Gerstner, who had studied at Westminster in the late 30s. Gerstner was very loyal to the United Presbyterian Church of North America. He taught at Xenia Seminary. And in the 1940s, he took a PhD at the Harvard Divinity School. And it's not exactly clear when he developed his interest in Edwards, but he did. And by the 1950s, he was doing research here in the Edwards papers. I think he met Tom Schaefer and was invited to be an editor in the works of Edwards' project. In 1959, he published a little book called Steps to Salvation, showing that Edwards was thoroughly reformed in his view of the steps to salvation. I never heard of that book at the time, but eventually Gerstner became a very prominent promoter of Edwards in conservative Reformed circles, particularly those that were connected with the with his United Presbyterian connections. His greatest influence probably was through his connection with the Ligonier Ministries, R.C. Sproul, and that put Edwards on the map in that little section. It's a considerable subsection of the Reformed community. Now, I say that in the middle of the century, Gerstner illustrates the problem in my view of things, and this is why I think that is so. Gerstner's Edwards was the Orthodox Edwards who was consistent with Turretin and therefore with Hodge and the Princetonians. So in 1955, he was speaking in Grand Rapids, where the Dutch were very suspicious of Americans in general, and Princeton was okay, but they had Princeton's suspicions of Edwards. And Gerstner said, however, that the mantle of Edwards fell not on the Taylors, Bushnells, Parks, Beechers, or Gladdens, but on the Alexanders, the Hodges, the Pattons, and the Warfields. So that's the continuity Gerstner was trying to establish. And on another occasion, he emphasized Edwards as a champion of inerrancy, which would be a very important point in bringing Edwards to, for instance, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where Gerstner sometimes taught as a visiting professor. And the culmination of his work on Edwards had that Princetonian tone to it. The title of this big 3-volume work is The Rational Biblical Theology of Jonathan Edwards. So although I think Gerstner's Edwards played a role in the recovery of Edwards in the Reformed community, it wasn't a sufficient sort of role. And the reason for that is that the Edwards being recovered was not so much the brilliant innovator, but rather the brilliant defender, rational defender of Reformed orthodoxy, that because Edwards like Turretin, then Edwards was a lot like Hodge. And so it wasn't the innovative brilliance that attracted people to Edwards, but it was his usefulness as an apologetic figure. Another early Reformed contribution that was considerable came from the Banner of Truth Trust in Great Britain and Ian Murray. That organization was founded in 1957 and had a large influence in inspiring study of the Puritans, and Edwards in particular. And in 1987, Ian Murray gave us a well-researched and thoroughly sympathetic account of Edwards' life in Jonathan Edwards, A New Biography. The Banner of Truth's Edwards emphasized both his orthodoxy and his piety, and the combination of orthodoxy and piety, and that Edwards was a sort of culminating exemplar of what's wonderful about the Puritan tradition, the intensity of the Puritan tradition. And that did provide some more enthusiasm for Edwards for the among Neo-Puritan sorts of Reformed people. Well, I'll come back to the Reformed story, but before I do, I want to look at the other story, and that is the prior recovery of Edwards, of a very different sort of Edwards, and the Edwards revival that came by the second half of the 20th century, centered here at Yale, and that is the mainline Protestant, neo-Orthodox, and mainline academic discovery of Edwards. These developments are familiar, I think, to many of you, so I only mention the highlights. But I think it is worth remarking that the baseline from the very early 20th century was that Edwards' reputation had hit a sort of low in the mainstream academia. I'd like to quote the statement from the 1920s from Henry Bamford Parks, saying that if Edwards had thought more deeply, he might have been one of the greatest figures in the history of American thought. All right? And Ola Winslow, in her 1940 biography, was much more sympathetic to Edwards, but then she says that we have to regret that Edwards spoke through an outworn dogmatic system that needed to be discarded. This non-creative Edwards, who was locked into a theological tradition, was in a way the mainstream equivalent of those later conservative and reformed who recommended Edwards because he was like Turretin and Hodge. Though mainline evaluations of Edwards however, were clearly changing by mid-century. And of course, Barry Miller had the huge impact, particularly through his 1949 intellectual biography, in which Edwards was just the opposite. He was all creativity. And for Miller, Edwards was not only was he not stuck in the past, he was the first modern American. He was transcending his tradition. And so he was a great artist, and Reformed theology just happened to be the medium for his art. But although Miller did a great deal for putting Edwards on the mainstream intellectual map, in order to recover a usable Edwards, I think there needed to be the mainline Protestant, what I would call a neo-Orthodox recovery of Edwards. And that was already underway by the time that Miller was writing. In 1932, A.C. McGifford published a sympathetic biography of Edwards. Same year, Joseph Haratunian's Piety versus Moralism, the Passing of New England Theology, told the story of the decline from the epic theological heights that Edwards had reached. So that signaled a wider neo-Orthodox looking at Edwards and finding very wonderful things in him. H. Richard Niebuhr here at Yale was one of the most prominent people promoting Edwards. Niebuhr wasn't particularly interested in the specifics of Edwards' Reformed theology or his biblicism, but rather he celebrated the essential of what he saw as the higher essence of Edwards' theology in recognizing the absolute sovereignty of God as the premise for understanding all reality. So in the mid-19th century, back then, in the mid-20th century, the centuries just come and go, this combination of neo-Orthodox and other mainline Protestant interest and enthusiastic, put an enthusiastic imprimatur on Edwards, and that combined with Barry Miller's endorsement of him put Edwards back in the center of certainly the American theological and also philosophical traditions. And that combination led to the organizing of the Works of Edwards project in the 1950s that brought together mostly neo-Orthodox scholars and some historians of American Christianity who were, for instance, some of Alstrom's students who were admirers of Edwards and of his theology. And of course, Yale was the ideal place for that all to happen, both because of the location of the Beinecke and the Edwards papers here, and Yale Divinity School itself was one of the great centers for American neo-Orthodoxy. By the time I came on the scene, this was opening new dimensions of Edwards' study. The Works of Edwards project was underway, and a couple of volumes had come out, and he was beginning to be seen by some as representing more broadly than just the Reformed tradition, the Augustinian tradition. And I think that came through in Haratunian, who sees the New England tradition as not being able to keep up with Edwards, and also it shows up in Elwood's book that I mentioned, published in about 1960 or so, for which Haratunian wrote the introduction. And then a whole series of books began recovering what I see as the essence of the really brilliant Augustinian Edwards. Roland de Latre's Beauty and Sensibility in the Thought of Jonathan Edwards came out in 1968. And then there was a lot of other works culminating, I think one could say, in Robert Jensen's 1988 volume on Edwards, titled somewhat optimistically as America's Theologian, a recommendation. And it's a very compelling recommendation of Edwards, even though Edwards turns out to be a good bit like Karl Barth when you finally get done with it. But I think the neo-Orthodox recovery of Edwards was an essential component in the Reformed enthusiasm for Edwards that was generated by the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And the Reformed, I think I can fairly say, unlike the Neo-Orthodox, actually had a substantial church constituency to work with, not large as such thing in scope, but substantial people who read books. And so the Neo-Orthodox rediscovery helped them, I think, move beyond seeing Edwards just as a very smart Puritan apologist for Reformed orthodoxy and inerrancy. And for that to happen, Reform needed theologians with a broader vision who pointed to the dynamics of the larger Augustinian tradition which Edwards and Reformed theology was a part. Now, I'm projecting, as you can tell, in part from my own take on Edwards, but there were other much more influential counterparts for this. I think one of the most important was probably Richard Lovelace at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. In 1979, he published his really classic book, I think, The Dynamics of a Spiritual Life. And it was written at the height of the inerrancy controversies among evangelicals, but it's a wonderfully, but rather than that, it's an alternative of wonderfully ecumenical theology, of seeing what can we learn from traditions that differ from ours. The first chapter is entitled Jonathan Edwards and the Jesus Movement, and it provides a framework for seeing Edwards as a way to promote evangelical theology. One person influenced there by Lovelace at Gordon Conwell was Tim Keller. Before he went to studied at Westminster, he studied there, and he writes this. He says, I took several courses with Richard Lovelace at Gordon Conwell Seminary, including the first course, Dynamics of Spiritual Life, in the fall of 1972, that eventually became Lovelace's book. Along with that course, I also took a course he did on Evangelical Awakenings, a history of revivals. To say that these courses were seminal in my thinking and way of doing ministry is a pretty big understatement. Anyone who knows my ministry and reads this book will say, so that's where Keller gets his stuff. And so I think a generation of evangelicals who read Lovelace or were in touch with Gordon Conwell were similarly influenced, and Gordon Conwell continues to be a center for studying sort of evangelical, Reformed, and revivalist. Meanwhile, John Piper, on the other side of the country at another evangelical seminary at Fuller, was picking up the same sorts of ideas. Sometime around 1970, he was studying with his favorite professor, Dan Fuller, and Dan Fuller was upset that a student had accused him, Fuller, of being too rationalistic. And Fuller responded, and this is Piper quoting, Fuller responded that Jonathan Edwards could move easily from lucid, complex logical arguments into a devotional style that would warm your grandmother's heart. And then Piper writes, that was all I needed. I was off to the library to find this hidden treasure. Piper speaks as though he discovered pretty much on his own the dynamics of joy in Edwards, as comes out in the God and Trance View of All Things, title of one of his books. The Edwards he discovered was in any case not only the defender of Reformed orthodoxy, but rather much more the Edwards whose theology invoked the grandeur that you could find in the Neo-Orthodox appreciation of him, but remaining in a very strictly Reformed and biblicist, even inerrantist kind of context. I find it reveal, and I'll just take these two examples. There are other examples, I suppose, that I don't know. Rick Warren was mentioned as someone who is a great Edwards fan. I find it revealing in the case of both Keller and Piper that they both will cite up front both Edwards and C.S. Lewis in saying what their biggest influences on them are. I happened to recently get the opportunity to do a little book on C.S. Lewis, and I was struck by that commonality, that even though Lewis was a theological minimalist and Edwards a theological maximalist, nonetheless, they both worked from the Augustinian tradition, and for both, there's an idealism where beauty is at the center of things. And the American evangelical appropriation of Lewis as one of their patron saints comes about the same time in the later decades of the 20th century as this not quite as large, appropriation of Edwards in certain Reformed circles. And I think what's going on is in part a response to the anti-intellectualism and the shallowness of a lot of evangelical theology. And they're finding in both these figures, here's something that's much more substantial in relating us to the mainstream Christian tradition. I also like to think that we historians had something to do with the rediscovery of Edwards in the evangelical world. I think Mark Knoll, for instance, played an immeasurable role in his 1994 Jeremiah, the scandal of the evangelical mind. He presents Edwards as an example of what the evangelical mind could be, and then laments Edwards had no intellectual successors. And in a number of his other works, Edwards plays a similar role, particularly in America's God, from Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln. By 1984, thanks to Knoll and Nathan Hatch, who by the way, were classmates of John Piper at Wheaton, Wheaton was on the map of Edwards' scholarship. The Institute for the Study of American Evangelicalism in 1984 had a conference there bringing in many mainline kinds of scholars, and eventually Skip Stout and Hatch published the resulting volume, Jonathan Edwards and the American Experience. Hatch signed on to be an editor of one of the sermon volumes in the Edwards works of Edwards publication. And that's just one example of the convergence of mainline and Reformed contributions to Edwards studies that was beginning to develop, particularly in the works of Edwards Project. John Gerstner, much to his chagrin, was dropped from the project, partly because of problems of translating Edwards, but also, I think, for theological incompatibility. But in the meantime, the works of Edwards Project came to be headed by two people with strongly Reformed backgrounds, Skip Stout, who, when he was a student at Calvin, was something of a bad boy, which may be no surprise, and Ken Minkema, who studied, I think Ken studied with Skip at Connecticut, and then
you at Calvin.
And with me at Calvin, yeah, did I say that? Yeah, that they both studied with me at Calvin, and then they were connected to each other. 1986, Skip came here and eventually became the distinguished Jonathan Edwards Professor, and Ken came here and became the par excellence decipherer of Edwards, and together they eventually transformed the works of Edwards Project into the Jonathan Edwards Center in 2003. And that project then brought in many younger scholars who worked on the Edwards Project and went on to other Edwards work. And I was one beneficiary of that. Skip recruited me to do the big biography of Edwards. He came to me and said, "We need someone to do the 300th anniversary thing, and I don't want to do it." And so I agreed, and that was a wonderful opportunity. I was hoping. I mean, I wanted to work on Edwards in any case. And then I was a beneficiary of Ken's work because I was one of the early people to have much of the new work electronically. It was on computer disk, but I could search sermons and find some things that hadn't been found out before. And so I was one beneficiary of a much larger development here in what became the Jonathan Edwards Center, and became the source for what you might say is, Adrian Neely actually said to me, the democratization of Jonathan Edwards' study, that once it's online digitally, it becomes available to everyone and can become available throughout the world. So it's an amazing story that in 1963, when I first discovered Edwards, Edwards was hardly unknown in most church communities. By today, here we are with representatives of Edwards from quite a few countries around the world, and it's at least a substantial kind of development. I think the sheer availability of Edwards' writings, and some writings that had not been available before, is one explanation for that, but it's certainly not sufficient explanation. I think the sufficient explanation has to do with recognizing the luminous quality in Edwards' thought, and that is a product of the accumulated studies on Edwards and theological studies of Edwards that you can find really brilliant insights into Edwards under almost every aspect of his work by now. I'm generalizing again, I'll say from my own experience, but I think the Edwards that comes through is people simply discover this is a brilliant theologian that we can really sink our teeth into, and there's much more to be found than has been found even already. And so his being reformed is important to most of the people that discover him, and it makes the Reformed theology a wonderful lens to see sort of the essence of the Augustinian tradition and the beauty of the Trinitarian love that God invites us all into. So even though the Works of Edwards project started as another publication project for the works of a great American, like the Benjamin Franklin project that was mentioned, it's turned into an amazingly much more than that. And I think that is due to both the work of the people here and the internationally compelling, and maybe I should say universally compelling vision of Edwards himself, that once people discover it, they can get hooked on it. So I'm thankful for all that this center has done and all the people that it's inspired, and I'm very grateful to have played a small supporting role in that. So thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for that stimulating whirlwind tour of Edwards scholarships from the 19th century to the present. I was reminded in listening to you just how far we've traveled in Edwardsian studies really in the last 40 years or so, and proud to have played a small role myself in creating the Jonathan Edwards Center. There's one component to the Jonathan Edwards Center that was not mentioned that I would like to single out now, and that's the support that we've enjoyed from Yale Divinity School and Dean Sterling. For a long while, we had embarrassingly rich support from foundations, but they changed their direction and orientation, and that kind of went away, and we really faced a crisis. And into that crisis, the Divinity School stepped in. Greg in particular, though I think it probably even began earlier with Harry Attridge, who's sitting over there to my left. And I don't know where we would be today without that support, both programmatic, office space, and funding. But I want to thank George for a tremendous lecture. And I want to thank him even more for his scholarship, because he understated it a little, but that had a huge amount to do with this Renaissance that he's described. And you got to see some of the fruits of it here. So thank you, George.